This is Charlene Margot, and I am co-founder of nonprofit The Parent Venture. We are delighted to have with us today Anya Kamenetz, who will be talking with you about a very important topic, how and why to talk to kids about climate change. Welcome, Anya.
Charlene, thank you so much for having me, and thanks for having me back to the Parent Venture. This is such a unique and special organization, and you do so much good for the families all across the country. I hear now in all 50 states, which is super exciting. And I appreciate your grace in having me on as I'm starting to talk about this topic, which is so near and dear to my hearts. And I think that, there is a reason that this is maybe a smaller gathering today, which is that this is just so hard to talk about and it's very new to a lot of people. And so what I'm hoping to do is provide us a frame of reference, right, for why we're doing this and also how to approach it. And I hope that each and every person that goes out from here tonight is resolved to have this conversation, at least with one other parent or one other person in their orbit, because that's how this is all going to spread. So with your permission, I'm going to now share my screen and share my slides. I just have a few slides to share. Just the evolution that I've taken just in the last couple of years, as Charlene mentioned, I worked on Life Kit in partnership with Sesame Workshop. That series was all about difficult parenting conversations. So straight on the nose of what this is about, which is how do we talk about the things that are hard to talk about? We talked about in that podcast series, talking to kids about death, talking to kids about race, talking to kids about sex, which are all kinds of frames of references in interesting different ways, as well as talking to kids about scary stuff in the news. There was another one that came up, and all of them, I think, connect to the climate conversation in a way that I'm going to get into. Then my last book was all about kids and COVID, and that really got me into, you have this big society-wide threat. How do we respond to it from the point of view of children? If we had a child-centric society, how would that look, and what would our COVID response would be? And you can ask that question about a lot of issues that face America today, like gun violence is very much in my heart right now. But I'm thinking these days about climate change, and I believe that it's time for this conversation. So increasingly, we see that climate anxiety comes when you get that pregnancy test, and it's part of perinatal decision-making for families. It comes when you have a kid and you say, gosh, this world is really different than it was maybe when I was growing up. And we know that climate change is no longer a future question. It's no longer a faraway question, but it's a right now question. This is from the Rapid Survey, which is conducted monthly with a representative group of 1,000 parents across the country of children under 6. They have said, as of April 2023, that 57% of those families have already experienced some extreme weather event since they've been a family. So whether that's a drought, a flood, a wildfire causing air quality issues, or just an extreme, or not just, but or an extreme heat wave, this is a right now issue for so many families. And if it's not right now, it could very well be this summer or this fall. So we need to talk about it. And the other reason we need to talk about it is that our kids, as they get just a little bit older, and we're talking about 9 to 10 years old, they are hearing about climate change on the news and they are worried about it. 75% of Gen Z youth, that's 14 to 22-year-olds, have experienced already anxiety, stress, or overwhelm as a result of consuming news about climate change. So when they hear it on the news, they don't hear it from us. They don't have a frame of reference. They hear about the problem, but not about the solutions. This is very dangerous to their mental health. And we know that we are in a youth and adolescent mental health crisis. That is the words of the Surgeon General. It is the words of the American Academy of Pediatrics. We're in a mental health crisis, and news about climate change is contributing to that. Now, we might think that the antidote to that is simply not to talk about it, to shut up the news. And it's true that being measured about the amount of information that you take in and, not doom scrolling it's important. It's important to have information hygiene and news hygiene. However, we can't shield our kids. And the antidote to anxiety is actually having a coping mechanism and a coping strategy. And you don't have to take that from me. We can listen to the youth on this. Often when I talk about this issue, I really try to have a teenager on the panel with me. We presented to the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and we had Zuzu, who's 16, is a climate activist in New York. And she said, her perspective is that since COVID, there's been a culture around parents of protecting your children. And that's an issue with the climate movement, but really there's nothing to protect you from, because there's a lot of hope and there's a lot of action that you can take to create more hope. And so her message to parents is, please don't keep that silence. And I've heard from other teenagers saying, silence isn't really an option anymore. We're going to find out about it, and one way or the other. And so the question then is, what is our role as parents? How do we be the mentors that they need and create the context where it's safe to talk about this? And that's what I've been trying really hard to do. So with many collaborators, I have created a resource that I'm going to take you through in a little while. But first, I'm going to give an analogy here. So that's my dad and my daughter. And in January of this year, I had to sit my daughter down and give her the following information. I said, Grandpa and Grandma, they're coming up to stay with us here in New York. And the reason for that is that Grandpa has cancer. Now, do you know what cancer is? This means that there's cells in his body, they're multiplying, and they need to be treated. And so he's coming here to get treatment. And the doctors are they're very, very good doctors. They're going to make him feel better, but it's surgery. So he's going to need to recover. He's going to be tired. He's going to need help from me. And there are things that we can all do to help him recover. And so I would really love your help, making cards for him, making sure that he's comfortable when he's feeling better. You can come and help play games with him and take him on walks. And together we're going to do this. And I also shared, I stopped and made sure that there was space, asked her if she had any questions, explained a little bit of the science behind, how the surgery works and why it works, and how you follow up with afterwards with the cancer to make sure that it's not growing back. And then I talked to her I said, I'm a little bit worried. This is my dad. And these are the things that I'm going to be doing. I'm going to need maybe some hugs from you, a little bit of reassurance and downtime. And it's okay if you're feeling a little bit worried too. Everybody's a little bit worried, but we're going to get through this. He's got really good doctors, and everybody has a piece that they can do to help. So this is a conversation that many of you may have been familiar with at some point in your life. And the reason that I'm kind of taking the time to break it down is that these are all the main parts of the climate conversation. So we really want to be able to be clear and kind. We want to let them talk about, any questions that they might have. We want to allow for, explanation of the science, not to an overwhelming degree, but to an appropriate degree, so they really understand what is going on here. The conversation could have gone in a couple of different directions if my daughter had been maybe more anxious or more outspoken. Is Grandpa going to die, right? How long is he going to live? And these are questions I couldn't answer, right, definitively, just like we can't answer those questions definitively with climate change, but we can be very reassuring. We can say, with the cancer, we can say, well, he's got great doctors, they're working really hard. With climate change, you can and should say, there are millions of people working so hard on this, working on clean energy, working on activism. And that is really important. We can't talk about climate change and the size of the problem that it is without talking about the solutions and talking about the amount of people that are out there working on all kinds of solutions. It's very, very important to give that sense of hope and not to make it feel like it's all on the kids' shoulders. Now, what is also important as well, and that I'd used in the grandfather conversation, is you're empowering the child to say that there's something you can do to help. So I talked about how you can help take care of Grandpa. This is also true with the earth. We can all help take care of, be part of the positive actions, and talking about positive actions you can take as a family is definitely a recommended strategy. Now I'm going to go ahead and go to the resources, which are downloadable at this link, and the link is in the chat. And we have basically given a downloadable PDF, and there's a version in Spanish. And I'm going to just go through it pretty quickly. So these are kind of background ideas about, making sure that you've got a safe space, a quiet space, a time of day where you can be focused and present. Sometimes this might happen spontaneously. It happened with my daughter about climate change, where she kind of brought it up out of the blue one night. And then ensuring that people feel safe to have the conversation. The next part is to listen, to ask if they have any questions. I'm here to listen. Any feeling is okay. If you want to take it in a different direction, you can start by asking them, what do you know about climate change? And build off the knowledge that they already have. We have links in here for how you can look up information. I also have a separate downloadable PDF, which is about the sort of background knowledge at an elementary school level. Then we really think it's important to talk about, how are you feeling about climate change? What are the feelings? Can you express that through a picture? Can you express it through movement? There are lots of different ways to express feelings. And then sharing your own feelings in an appropriate way as well. And then we do talk about, talking about actions, but not turning it into something, this is what we're going to fix. There's no silver bullets here, and it's not all on our kids' shoulders. You can talk about actions that you are taking as well, and choices that you're making, and then talk about possible actions you could take together. And then, I think that it's also really important. We have tips for self-care and well-being, emphasizing again that this is an emotional conversation, right? And people's ability to handle emotions, their window of tolerance, if you will, for different types of emotions really depends on many different factors, like the stress that you're under or the trauma that you may have experienced. So it's going to vary even from day to day, but it's always really important to have a toolbox for self-care and well-being when talking about climate or any other difficult issue with kids. And then, we do talk about different options for taking action. I'm happy to answer any questions that people have about specifically climate activism or decarbonization of schools or home electrification. These are all great ways you can do it. And there's more resources at the link. So that is really what I had to share with you tonight. And I'm, again, happy to offer any kind of context or background to expand on this and why I think it's important.
Thank you, Anya, for that. We're really excited to be able to share that resource with our families. And, we've known you for a while now through a couple of books and some iterations through NPR, and then your work as an author and journalist. Can you tell us what got you down this path that brought you to This Is Planet Ed and the Aspen Institute?
Yeah, it really was, thanks for that question. It really was a step-by-step journey. But I think what really took me here was realizing that my work had a theme that I didn't even know that it had, which is this idea of generational justice. So when I think about something like, how do we create schools that measure achievement that in a way that's actually meaningful for kids? Or how do we make college more accessible and more affordable to more people? These are really questions of fairness, and they're fairness for our children, and the fact that every child really deserves the conditions that they need to thrive. And with the COVID-19 pandemic, I just saw unequal impacts being visited on children because of the way that we didn't center their needs, whether that was a need to have appropriate educational services, mental health services, the danger that many kids were exposed to, of course, losing a family member to COVID. We didn't always keep their needs in top of mind. And I feel that the impact of our decisions with children, they're always going to be multiplied because children are long-term investments. The payoff is down the road and they multiply over time. And they have critical periods in their development that cannot be made up. So a month or a year to a child is very different than a month or a year to an adult. And that's really what's kind of reoriented my worldview, is thinking about, how the various issues that we face as a society can be addressed by adopting a child-centric approach. So the child-centric approach is one that just any issue you can name, it takes it and it orients it around what do kids need? How could we make kids' lives better? And you can see it's almost, I know that you can agree with me on this, that it's going to make things better. Like, for example, think about what a city looks like when you look at it from the point of view of kids. All of a sudden, it's more walkable. It's got less traffic. It's got more parks, more libraries, more gathering places. It's safer, right? And these are all things that we want for our children, but honestly, we want them for everybody. So that is really what's led me to the consideration of climate change, because we know that this is the ultimate generational issue, where when you were born, the year you were born, is going to determine what your lifespan looks like because of these projections of where we're headed. And so we need to be the champions and be the advocates for kids. And there's no issue like climate change. And the children know this because they're taking it up and they're making it their central issue for all of these reasons. And I just want to be on their side.
I love that, Anya. You know, I am from Palo Alto, where my high school, Cumberly High School, which doesn't exist anymore, had the very first Earth Day in the nation way back like in the 1980s. So we were a model for Stanford. They picked up that Earth Day.
Mm-hmm.
Why are we 40 years later not farther along? Why did those things not pick up, do you think?
You know, that's such a great question. And I think it is important to honor that there have been many victories along the way with the environmental movement in conservation, in things like acid rain, the EPA, you know, increasing energy efficiency standards. But, you know, at the same time, there was a very, very successful effort by the fossil fuel industry to shift the focus away and shift the blame away from themselves. And we saw it. I mean, it's very interesting because you look at tobacco, right? So we see how the role of tobacco in Americans' lives dramatically shifted and really fell apart because citizens were able to lobby and get the industry on the record and show how they had been indifferent to people's lives. And they never really recovered from that loss of face and really the fraud that they'd perpetrated on people with incredible use of PR to kind of muddy the waters about whether or not smoking caused cancer and put doctors in ads for cigarettes, right? But they had their comeuppance. And what happened then, Amy Westervelt's done this amazing journalism on this topic, is that the oil industry hired and scooped up all of the PR people from the cigarette industry. And they did the whole same playbook, which is that get your own scientists, set up your own bogus think tanks, put people on the payroll, and bombard the media with a both sides narrative and say, and where did we get this? So we grew up and we are still living with the effects of this in the 70s and the 80s with climate change as a debate. Well, some scientists say this and sometimes they say that. And you have to show both sides. And then it's become totally politicized. We're the only country in the world where there is a major political party that doesn't take climate change seriously. I mean, that's a very unusual situation to be in. And we, of course, are a huge fossil fuel industry leader. So having our own, you know, having our own energy exports and being in the energy business is a big part of that. I'm from Louisiana, so I see this, you know, I knew this firsthand. The petrochemical industry is so big there. And that's people's livelihoods. And you can't take that lightly. So to me, it's a business story. And it's a story about a fraud on the American public, misinformation, disinformation. It's not about the efforts of environmentalists. I think that you can fault activists for, you know, and we always do. Everybody always looks to look at what are the activists doing wrong. You know, we took the bait on the idea that environmentalism was about personal choices, that it was about your carbon footprint, that it was about recycling. Recycling and the carbon footprint were both made up by companies, right? You probably remember when the milkman took your bottles back, right?
Yep.
Well, that was producer responsibility. That's how it's supposed to be. When you have this cheap plastic and then it's supposed to be your job to put that Coke bottle back or otherwise it gets in the ocean. No, I mean, it should be the company's job, but they were able to say, oh, it's recycling. And then what happens then? The only thing that children know about when it comes to environmentalism is they know about recycling, which is basically for plastic, not right.
That is so interesting. Yes, I did grow up with the milkman coming so we could have warm peaches and cream every morning. We thought it was a perfect system, right? You put the bottles back, they disappear, and then they come again.
Yeah.
There's no reason why we couldn't still be doing that, is there?
Nope.
No.
There's some efforts to that effect, but you know, it's a whole system that we're having to undo now.
That's so interesting. So what do you think is the youngest we should get kids involved in this? I know you have young children, but is this something we should be really doing full on with our preschoolers?
There's a lot of interesting conversation about that. The Aspen This is Planet Ed program has an early childhood task force. And so I've been involved in some of those conversations. When we talk about climate literacy at the early childhood level, you know, unfortunately, we have to say that you might have young children that are exposed to extreme weather.
Mhm.
So for their safety, they are going to have to know things about you wear a hat if it's hot outside.
Mhm.
You might not go outside if it's a bad day. And we know because we saw our early childhood experts pivoting to explain to toddlers and preschoolers how to wear a mask, put a mask on the baby doll to show them how to do it. So these are facts that kids need to know to be safe in their world. Drink enough water, stay hydrated. Um, Climate change on a global level is a very high level concept. And so the other parts we focus on with the preschool age are um, very much like in the Montessori vein. You have care of self in the Montessori landscape and care of environment. And that means your physical surroundings around you. But you can certainly fold into that care of for living things and awareness of resource use, right? So what are we talking about? We're talking about turning off the faucet, turning off the lights, right? Not using plastic, not, reducing our uses of things and thinking about what's the proper place to put our trash. So these are basic care of environment concepts. And then the third pillar of it is really the love of nature. So there's so much support. You don't need a climate person to tell you this, that little kids need to play outside, right? That they need to love nature and they need to learn to respect nature and respect living things, but really just the pure joy of it. So those are the building blocks. So we've got the emergency preparedness, safety part, health part. You've got the care of self, care of environment, care of our world, and then you got the nature love.
Well, we're out here in California in Silicon Valley, and I don't have to tell you, the last 2 years with forest fires, there were no children who were not impacted. I mean, I remember the day that the sky turned orange.
Yeah.
Oh, there's not very much you can, a 4-year-old knows that all of a sudden the sky is orange.
Yes, they do.
And that you started out, what is the number again of the kids that have been impacted?
57% of families with children under 6.
That is shocking, isn't it?
It is.
57%.
Yeah, it happened
Not
fast.
flooding, we don't have hurricanes, but we have fires. You have all kinds of things in Louisiana.
Mhm. Yeah. Yes. And I heard a story today. I was at a gathering about early childhood that the children in Houston, the early childhood educator had to draw the blinds because the children were scared when it rained. They were scared they were going to have another rain event like they did with Harvey, which was 40 inches of
Really?
rain. So that made an impression. I mean, this makes an impression on our kids, right? This
Yeah,
is
yeah.
formative. So now we're talking a little bit about trauma and we're talking about caregiver stress. This is stressful for parents.
Mhm.
And it's not going to be something that they snap back from immediately. Kids can be very resilient. We are their environment, especially in the early years. And so we need to manage our own climate anxiety. We need our own self-care. We need our own practices. If we have angst around, what's happening with the sky, and how could you not, right? Then we're going to have to have our own practices around it. I mean, honestly, truly, this is what is leading me into this work. And I think more and more people are starting to have this experience where they say, I've got to do something. And I really believe that if you have kids today, then you need to be involved in this issue in some way because you can't manage your anxiety other than by positive action. I mean, you can try, but yeah, you're gonna have to be
I'm
working.
really glad you brought that up because I pulled actually this definition from the American Psychology Association for eco-anxiety, which is a term now, right? So
Yes.
that is defined as the chronic fear of environmental cataclysm that comes from observing the impact of climate change and the associated concern for one's future and that of next generations. So this is what we parents, children, young children are experiencing together, right?
That's right. That's right. And it's really important to have that frame because one thing that we know about anxiety, and we've been learning more about it, is that exposure is important, right? So we learn we don't conquer our anxiety by avoiding and shutting down. That's going to really limit our lives. But we need to be exposing ourselves to the uncomfortable feeling. And, what they call in the trauma informed world, widening your window of tolerance.
Mhm.
That doesn't mean that you mainline climate news, but it means that you engage in information and coping. And the coping is going to take the form of doing things about the problem and also managing your emotions in other ways, physically, exercise, all of the things that we do to manage our emotions. So yeah, I mean, eco-anxiety is one of those things that it is real because it's definitely happening.
Mhm.
Um, And this is why I use the analogy of, my dad, thankfully he's doing well now, but, our lives are richer because we have him in our life, and we know that you're not going to have him around forever. And that's just a fact of how we're living. So, you don't avoid the topic because it hurts. You have to start really wrap your arms around it as well as you can.
Although you demonstrated so nicely, Anya, how you can chunk that out for younger children, give your middle schooler or teen more information, but a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old need very different things, right?
That's exactly right. And I mean, there's the 5 and 10-year-old issue, but there's also the issue of like some kids, their minds are going to go to, well, is he going to be okay or not? And other kids are just going to assume that he's okay. Right. So you have like the level of anxiety is important to calibrate. I think with something, an issue like climate change, I think it's important to be sensitive to that for sure.
Okay. So listen, attendees, please do put your questions in the Q&A box. We are a webinar, so that's not set up to raise your hand and speak, but we really want to hear from you. Put those questions in the Q&A. That's why we're here. Anya, you've written about how parents want their kids educated about the changing climate, yet many or most schools are not doing so. Why is that?
Well, they're not doing it yet. And I think that there is movement in this issue, in this area. The reason that they're not doing it is that, up until this point, we don't have national curriculum standards in this country. Next generation science standards do cover climate change somewhat briefly in middle school science. And so we've kind of been up to this point relegating it to the science classroom. And I think that's been a mistake.
You do?
I do, because this is actually a massive social phenomenon that affects everything and everybody. And it's so much more relevant to kids when they start learning about how it's affecting their cities, how it's affecting, how it intersects with social justice, and how they can express their thoughts and feelings about climate change culturally. Like, I really want to see this, and this is starting to happen. So the state of New Jersey actually has is out front in terms of requiring climate change to be taught every grade and every subject. Yeah. And California is working on this, something called 10 strands, which is going to be a very woven in curriculum. And that's going to be, I'm guessing that it's going to be pretty comprehensive, like probably influential to other states as well. So, it's starting to happen. And it's an exciting time because teachers are really figuring this out in real time. There are huge obstacles. The fossil fuel industry has made curriculum and been into classrooms giving materials to teachers about the wonders of fossil fuels. And they've been doing that since the 1950s. And in a state like Oklahoma or a state like Louisiana, where I'm from, where family members may be working in the coal or oil industry, it can be a very fraught topic. So teachers told us in 2019 for NPR, we did a survey of teachers. And 4 out of 5 said, yes, children need to know about this, but only 45% said they were teaching about it. And the reasons they gave were, well, the kids are too young. It's not my area. It's not my topic. I don't know enough to do it. And I'm afraid I'll get pushback from parents. Too controversial. And then increasingly, I also hear it's too depressing. The kids are going to get nervous. And they've even heard from teachers that they're going to, that I've heard from teachers in the last few weeks that I've been talking about this, that the parents are like, please stop talking about this. My kids are worried.
That doesn't work. That doesn't
work. That's why I'm looking at the parent education piece, because I think it's hand in hand. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I could not agree more. I think about we have to be sophisticated about this. 5 years ago, representatives from Jewel, which was founded by 2 of my daughter's Stanford classmates, they were offering free parent education to schools. We said, oh, no, we're not bringing the people from Jewel to talk about vaping. And so I'm sure that the same thing, it's ripe for the same kind of influence. So we do have to be smart about this, right?
I see so many analogies with tobacco, as I've talked about before. One of them is like, that the message about the industry and the messages the industry gives tends to be kind of empowering because, right or wrong, young people like a story with heroes and villains, and we all kind of do. And so when you talk about the fact that the industry is doing this, it can be, to my mind, it's galvanizing. I hear it from teenagers as well, and young teenagers, tweens, that, it's like you can direct your ire at these companies that want to do these things, and we have the clear target and for action.
All right, we have some great questions coming in from the audience, Anya, so let's have at it. Here, this is a really good question. How do you motivate climate activism in teens, middle, and high schoolers?
I love this question. It's a tricky one because we're talking about a developmental phase where you really want them to be discovering their own agency and their own voice. And there's so many wonderful examples of young people doing that. We can't drag them kicking and screaming into the activism world. We can be models and we can invite them in. And so I would advise that, you offer them the opportunities, you help them be in situations where they're in contact with the near peers or the older peers that are doing this thing that are very cool. And there is so many amazing climate influencers out there. I mean, you could just trip over them on Instagram, on TikTok, that are putting out their voices and really making it fun and making it exciting and being incredible communicators. I'll throw out is called the Garbage Queen on TikTok. And so whatever it is that they're excited about, whether it's fast fashion or whether it's, the ocean, there's going to be somebody out there who's doing something where they can find their way. So, when you have a kid that age, you're opening doors. You're not shoving in their faces. And I mean, this is my analogy I'll take, that I feel like this is my master stroke as a mom, is I'm so good at cutting up the fresh veggies and just leaving them on a plate near them.
Yeah.
But I don't say anything.
It's really smart. It's really smart. So we've gone beyond just folks like Greta Thunberg, who has done so much. There's a whole slew of these young mentors and activists now. Yeah.
Absolutely. And again, I mean, there's, such inspirational figures, and the kids that these kids are really looking up to are doing such cool things, and with intersectional identities as well. So
queer, brown, vegan. Okay, we're going to check these out, Anya. All right. Again, more great questions coming in. Let's try some more. Here, John asking, action is truly the antidote for despair. I've experienced it firsthand. Get involved. How do we get other parents to get involved and take action? Folks' lives are so busy. Many have bigger immediate needs than climate change. Any suggestions welcome?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I mean, that's an organizer's question, so that's great. I have looked at research about this, and the number one thing that parents say that they're willing to do on behalf of climate is host a gathering or go to a gathering. So thinking about ways to build community, and possibly stack that with something that's going to be of benefit to, the kids that you have in the school that you go to and the other things that you have in common, right? So a great example, and one that we're talking about a lot with Aspen, and this is Planet Ed, is a decarbonization. So there's billions of dollars available to green our schools with federal money, but it takes parent and student level action and school board action to actually get those things off the ground. So if you're okay with this, I'm going to put a couple links in the,
Sure.
We have a parent toolkit. And so thinking about what is going to be inviting to parents, and how you can kind of like draw them gently down that path, and making it fun, and hopefully opening the door to then doing something bigger down the road.
All right. So here's another good question. They're all good questions. Parent looking for advice on do's and don'ts when talking to 12 and 13-year-olds about climate change. Is there anything you suggest we should avoid?
That's a great question. Again, I'm very interested in autonomy with kids this age, and letting them lead in the conversation. So you can look for openings in the news. You can look for openings in a television show that you watch together. Maybe even a short video that you see on social media, and use it as an opener to say, what do you know about this? What questions do you have about this? It could be about the weather. Obviously, if there's something in the news about the weather, that could be something that's an opener. The news that kids are focusing on is extremely dire. It's very doom and gloom. And so it's really important that we are just as comprehensive about talking about solutions. And I recently was at a high school in the South Bronx where the kids were learning about environmental racism, and they're learning about the history of, the highway that would run in the South Bronx and why it's called Asthma Alley, because they're exposed to this noise and this air pollution. And it's also susceptible to coastal flooding. But the kids are very, very oriented towards action, towards solutions, but they do have in their minds kind of the uninhabitable earth, right? So I think that book did good and harm, right? Where by David Wallace Wells, where he really was talking about these really super doom and gloom scenarios. And I went back and I shared with that class an article that same author had published, David Wallace Wells, in 2022, where he admitted that the worst case scenarios that he had published 5 years ago were no longer really in the realm of possibility, because we've cut expected warming in half in just 5 years. I know. And I don't think there's been enough talk about this. I think that there's, a really important story. And the name of this article is called Beyond Catastrophe, that concerted effort by governments, the incredible crash in the price of solar power and activism has gotten us on a much better path. It doesn't mean it doesn't mean we're on easy street. There are scary things ahead. Yeah. 2 degrees is no picnic. 3 degrees is terrible. Mm-hmm. But 4 and 5 degrees is increasingly looking unlikely. So if we did that in 5 years, what can we do in the next 5 years?
So Anya, do you think it's still helpful to do things like, in California, we have schools adopt a beach in the spring and they go do a cleanup? Are events like that helpful, not helpful, too small? What do you think?
I would never stand here and say that anything that you do to clean up your environment is too small. I mean, it is the actions that we take shape our beliefs, and they strengthen our conviction to take more action. I do think so. That's important, right? I mean, it is, and it matters to that street, and it matters to whatever sea creature that doesn't get plastic, in their water if you pick it up. So I think that's important. I also think too that it takes legislative advocacy and it takes work. We're in this situation now. This is a really interesting time for citizenship, because the Inflation Reduction Act showers money for decarbonization onto schools, onto communities, but the take up requires a lot of work. I mean, I'm trying to figure this out in my own school right now, and it's just, I know all the pieces of it, but figuring out how to be noisy and knock on those doors, and it's use it or lose it money. So if you don't get the grant, the tax credit, the green bank, if nobody claims it, somebody else might claim it, or it might not get spent. And so the projection in the IRA of how many electric vehicles we're going to take, or how much solar panels are going to get installed, that depends on advocacy. And I would add that, some of that, especially in places like California, it's like people are fighting, they might fight a wind farm, or they might fight transmission lines. And you need other citizens on the other side to stand up at that zoning meeting and saying, no, yes, we do want this in our backyard, right? So there's a lot of nitty gritty work to be done right now.
Yeah, parent comments here. There was a recent EV ride and share event held in my town in the South Bay, which my middle schooler attended with great enthusiasm.
That's really great.
Every effort is worthwhile, right?
I think so. I mean, I also want to say that we can't, it isn't up to any of us alone. And you have to do activism at a pace that feels sustainable for you. And it's okay to take breaks and let someone else take over for a while. But definitely, everything that we can do is better than not doing it.
Anya, you touched on the politics of this issue, and you've written about the fact that perhaps, and hopefully, concern for our kids' well-being can unify Americans around climate crisis. Do you think we can do that?
There's been a lot of work on the other side to make it an identity issue, whether or not you care about climate change. We did a survey of Americans last fall, and it segmented the survey into 2/3 that were climate concerned and 1/3 that was less climate concerned. And they would tend to say things like, oh, it's been too politicized, or I'm not that worried for myself personally. But even in that 1/3, half of them still agreed we have a moral imperative to address climate change for the sake of the young and future generations. So it's an of two minds thinking about it. And I talked to one of these women, she's a grandmother living in Virginia, and she said, I don't know what I think about climate change. I think it's been pretty, the politicians try to make it seem scarier than it is. But when I think about how hot the summer's gotten and my grandchildren have to spend the whole summer inside in the air conditioning, they can't just get out and enjoy nature like they used to. That seems like a real problem. And I do think they should learn about it in school. And I do think we should do something about it. So it's not a silver bullet, but I do think it can be helpful to invoke that framing of the moral imperative for kids.
So Anya, when I first talked to you about this, when you were considering kind of your next steps, you mentioned that schools are uniquely situated with their infrastructures to be part of the solution. Can you talk to us about that? Why is that? What does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, we don't often think about this, but there's 100,000 school buildings in the country, was one in almost every neighborhood. And they have their giant food program and they have a giant bus program. And this is all publicly funded infrastructure. This belongs to the people. It's paid for by the taxpayers. And energy costs are typically the second largest line item in the budget after salaries for the school system. So
that's probably not a well-known fact.
Probably not a well-known fact. Because if you think about it, they don't pay rent on their buildings, right? So they pay for energy.
Yeah.
Now, I talked to a school system in in Acton, Massachusetts, and they cut their energy use by 35%. Some of it was like weather stripping on the windows and LED lighting, but an incredible amount of it, like most of it, was unplugging things. They had an unplug it, power it down initiative, unplug the coffee maker, unplug the copy machine, unplug everything when you go on vacation, unplug things overnight. And I mean, you would not believe that the kind of this is an energy vampire. Think about all the things that plug in inside a school. And that's a behavioral campaign. So that was done by the teachers and the students. And this is the kind of thing that, it's a total win-win-win. There's nothing political about that. Everybody wants a lower electricity bill. And Batesville in Arkansas is a district that went solar several years ago before the pandemic, and they used that extra savings to raise their teacher salary to the highest in the county. So, again, these are ways that schools can be really influential in their communities. The other dimension to that is that schools can be resilience hubs. So in one of the recent hurricanes in Florida, there's a town in Florida that has been built from scratch as a climate resilient solar community. It was built by some billionaire who decided to have a great project. And that school has solar powered, the school in the little town became a shelter during the storm. So people came in because it had power, it had electricity, it had air conditioning, and none of it missed a trick because it was all set up. So there's increasing talk about, can we keep our schools resilient with solar and batteries so that when there is another power cut, which happens all the time, that they're going to be places of refuge. This is really important during wildfires. I was hearing about, can they be a place where there's clean air and comfortable air that people need to shelter during a storm? So, yeah.
Well, I think about here in Silicon Valley, several of our high schools have turned the whole parking lot into covered solar panel lots.
Yes.
So then the cars and the kids and the teachers are cool, and you've got an entire freaking parking lot of solar panels. It just seems like such a no-brainer.
It really is a no-brainer. And I hope that everybody here, asks their local public schools what they're doing to take advantage of the money in the Inflation Reduction Act, because it's really, it's out there, and it's time to make this transformation. And it's an amazing, kind of moment to be able to say that.
Exactly. So Anya, we talked a little bit about why this conversation like we're having tonight is hard because of all the doom and gloom. What do you think is the best way for parents to open this conversation in a way that lets kids know that these issues, as you say, are solvable and there's people working on it? How would you open that with a teenager, for example?
Well, again, I would always start by asking what questions that they have,
Mm-hmm.
and then I would say, do you know about what's being done about these things? Do you have any thoughts about that? And help them figure out, if there's an area that they're particularly curious about or worried about, that's when you can kind of start to look at the solutions. And a site that I spend a fair amount of time on, because it's really reoriented my thinking, is drawdown.org. And they have a number of different resources that really get people picturing the solutions and the hierarchy of the solutions. And because different types of solutions have different contributions to the overall impact. And one that I've gotten super excited about, for example, weirdly enough, is agriculture land use. So thinking about how we can plant and grow food in a way that is regenerating the soil, storing carbon, having more trees, having more biodiversity. There's interesting debates about how we raise animals and how we use animals versus plant-based diets. But that's one big area that can be really, really interesting to learn about. But again, no matter what your child's interest is or teen's interest is, there's a climate solution that applies to it.
All right, so the trick is kind of to ask the questions, figure out what area might be of interest to your child, and then start to do some research to go down that path.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So take the kid's lead.
I mean, that's my approach to everything when it comes to teenagers.
Absolutely. They hate to be taken advantage of, right? I think that's why the campaign against vaping and Juul is now really making a difference, because kids realized that they were being duped essentially by these big companies.
That's exactly right. And I mean, a lot of teenagers have gathered a lot of hope and energy from being part of the Sunrise Movement, being part of, climate activism, whether that's online or in person or both, because they see that there are, people their age demanding a livable future.
All right. I think about, like, out here in California, Alice Waters, famously at Berkeley, who created Chez Panisse and this whole sort of natural food and gardening. One person can really make a big difference, right? And when those schools in Berkeley got on board, and then those kids are all eating natural organic food, if every little school could do that, it's not easy, but it's possible, right?
I think there's so much to be learned and taken directly from the green schools and the garden movement, because the school garden movement didn't come in with a lot of lofty claims necessarily about overhauling the entire curriculum, but they
Right.
just offered an experience that was so enticing and alluring, and it just spread from school to school. And and then the benefits became known and they became embraced, and it's just grown from there. So I think there's a lot to be learned from that, I think, in the climate education movement.
So Anya, you mentioned that you don't think that this climate change education belongs necessarily in just the science curriculum. If you could wave your magic wand and make this more integrated, for example, in a public high school, what would you do?
So I have an excellent example, and that's at Fannie Lou Hamer High School, where they have created in 9th and 10th grades an entire interdisciplinary STEAM curriculum around environmental racism and environmental justice.
Hmm.
So they're learning the history of the South Bronx. They're learning how and when the highways got built. They're learning about the impacts generationally and how that impacted the incomes, how it impacted their racial makeup. So these are social science questions, and then how it impacted with things like asthma, things like child mortality. And that's the science and the math part of it, the probability part of it. They do design projects. So they were working on, there's a proposal to take a portion of the highway that runs through the neighborhood and cap it, which means that you literally place something over it. So you're filtering the exhaust from the cars that go through, and then there's green space on top. And Columbia University did a study that found that for the people that live near this is 230,000 people, they're going to gain back months of life, because like 2 or 3 months of healthy life estimated. And that's because of the better air quality, access to green space, reduction in stress, reduction in noise pollution that comes from capping. So they had the teenagers model this. They did a little bit of the math, and then they built physical architectural models of the capping project. So this is an integrated curriculum that is telling kids things about their identity, about their history, And it's giving them math, it's giving them science, and then it's paired with civic activism. So they go out and they work and volunteer and do activism with the groups in the neighborhood that are working on revitalizing that area of the South Bronx. So this is a very comprehensive approach, and it's not just about climate change. At a higher level, what I would say is that what kids are asking for, so for example, in Portland Public Schools, kids are asking for to learn about climate science, climate justice, and climate mental health. So
climate mental health, look at that.
yeah, they are. They're saying this was, so they organized for net zero schools, physical school buildings, and they organized for those three things. So they said, we want to learn about the science. We want to learn about climate justice. In other words, how is this disproportionately impacting communities of color here and around the world? And how can we organize to fight it? So there's a civic education part of that. And then we want to learn, we need resources to cope with this. So, you know, mental health is, of course, an issue in every high school across the country. Climate mental health is really, I mean, it's a systemic issue. So this is not necessarily about your individual pathology or anything that's going wrong with you. It's just we need spaces to talk about this, to not be alone with our worries about this, and to share and to have self-care practices and to do things that as a community that help us build our resilience and feel better.
So Anya, a parent is asking here, can you give us any other examples of this interdisciplinary environmental curriculum being taught? You mentioned Portland, California has something in the works. Anything else you could point to? And again, John, thank you for all your comments here in the chat. We will organize these resources and make sure you get them, because we've had obviously very knowledgeable people sharing in the chat.
Yeah, and I love that. Thank you so much. You know, there's a lot of different resources for educators out there, kind of lesson by lesson. There's a program that I really like called Take Action Global, which essentially kind of enlists your school in a challenge where they can go and be with other schools and they can learn. There's a whole curriculum there, and they can also join together with other schools and do some advocacy as well. So that's an interesting project if you're interested in kind of networking with schools in other places.
All right, that's great. Parent says, my son, now a teenager, is passionate about the environment issues, and he's been active since elementary school with community projects, visiting the area alderman, advocating for better streets, etc. So lots of pathways for kids, lots of ways to get involved, right?
Definitely. That's great to hear about.
All right, so Anya, one last question. I know you to be a very passionate and educated and positive person. Climate change is a hard one, but when you look at the big picture, what gives you hope right now?
Thanks for asking me that. I really believe that hope is an attitude towards life. So the question is, what kind of life do you want to lead, and how do you want to spend your time? I don't know what's going to happen in the future. Nobody does. And I can only do my part. There's a quote from the Jewish writings, the sayings of the fathers, that says, you're not required to complete the work, but neither are you free to desist from it. So that's kind of the philosophy that I take.
That is really beautiful. Words to live by, Anya. So, boy, thank you, Anya Kamenetz. Thank you for everybody who was on with us tonight. We will take up this conversation again next year when we've learned more, and Anya has been longer with the Institute, but this was just a wonderful conversation. We cannot thank you enough. So again, kudos to everybody who joined us, but special thanks to Anya Kamenetz for all your advice and just brilliance. Just thank you. It was just a wonderful evening.